March 13th, 1945, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. The American medic unwrapped the girl's hands and froze. He'd seen shrapnel wounds that turned muscle into hamburger meat. He'd seen third-degree burns from tank fires that melted skin like candle wax. He'd seen gangrene from the Ardennes that required amputation within hours, or the patient died screaming. But he'd never seen a 17-year-old's fingers turn completely black and still attached to a living body. The tissue wasn't bruised, it was dead, necrotic. The kind of damage that should have killed her 3 weeks ago when blood poisoning reached her heart and stopped it cold. Corporal Samuel Pruitt stared at those impossible hands and whispered 4 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "How are you not dead?" Greta Hoffman sat perfectly still in the examination chair. Her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere above the medic's left shoulder. Her breathing came in short, controlled bursts through her nose. Pain had become such a constant companion over the past 5 weeks that she'd learned to ignore it the way you ignore the hum of a refrigerator or the tick of a clock. She'd crossed the Atlantic Ocean in the cargo hold of a Liberty ship with 40 other German women. No heat, no blankets, no medical care. The metal walls had sweated frozen condensation during February storms. Temperatures inside the hold had dropped so low their breath turned to frost on their lips and their tears froze on their cheeks before they could fall. 3 weeks of darkness and ice and the smell of 40 unwashed bodies pressed together in a space 20 feet square. 3 weeks of cold, so brutal it felt like being beaten with iron rods. 3 weeks waiting for the torture to begin. Because Greta Hoffman had been warned that Americans were savages. The propaganda had been clear and consistent and backed up by every authority figure she'd encountered since 1939. Capture meant death, slow death, painful death. Americans executed prisoners. They tortured women for sport. They had no honor, no mercy, no shred of human decency. When the ship's hold stayed freezing for 3 weeks straight, it seemed like confirmation. This was the beginning. This was how they broke you before the real cruelty started. But what happened in the next 43 minutes would shatter everything the Third Reich had taught her about enemies, about mercy, about which side of this war had been lying all along. This American medic, a farm boy from Oklahoma, who couldn't fight in combat because of a damaged ear, had every reason to let her hands die. His kid brother was fighting Japanese soldiers somewhere in the Pacific right now. German U-boats had torpedoed a merchant vessel in the Atlantic that killed his mother's younger brother. And the medicine he needed to save enemy hands was locked away in a cabinet marked for American soldiers only. What he did instead would risk his military career, prove his commanding officer wrong about everything, and demonstrate that one choice, one promise kept, could defeat an entire empire's propaganda machine. If you've never heard a World War II story like this, you're about to witness something powerful. Because this isn't about one hero saving one girl. This is about systematic American mercy destroying systematic hatred. This is about bacon and eggs proving more powerful than bullets. This is about hot showers and cold Coca-Cola defeating decades of lies. And by the end, when you hear the last words Greta Hoffman whispered 64 years later in a Berlin hospital room, you'll understand why this story matters more today than it did in 1945. Stay with me. Every minute counts. Every detail matters. Because what happened in Texas between March and November of 1945 changed 2 lives completely and proved something about America that the world needed to see. Let me take you back to that examination room, to the moment when everything Greta believed started to crumble. 17 years old. That's how young she was when Sam Pruitt first saw her hands. Blonde hair chopped brutally short. Not a fashion choice. Lice prevention. 3 weeks in a ship's hold with 40 women sharing 1 bucket for waste, and no running water meant hair got cut or it became a breeding ground for parasites. Her gray wool auxiliary uniform hung on her frame like a sack. The fabric was stiff with dried sweat and sea salt, and the particular stench that comes from wearing the same clothes for 23 days straight without washing. Brown stains marked the cuffs where infection had seeped through bandages. Yellow streaks showed where pus had dried and crusted over. And her hands, the gauze wrapping them, had once been white. 3 weeks ago when a Belgian guard had wrapped them after loading her onto the transport truck. But now the fabric was brown with dried blood, yellow with infection discharge, and in places almost black where necrotic tissue had oozed through the weave. The smell hit Sam before he got within 3 feet of her, sweet and rotten at the same time, the distinctive odor of flesh dying while the body still lived. He'd smelled it before on soldiers who'd lain in muddy foxholes for days with untreated wounds. Gangrene had a specific character. This wasn't quite that far progressed, but it was close, dangerously close. When Greta had boarded the Liberty ship in Belgium on February 14th, 1945, her fingers had been pink and healthy. She'd been cold, exhausted, terrified, but physically intact. The Auxiliary Medical Corps had trained her for 2 years before Hamburg University became a casualty clearing station instead of a school. She knew how to treat wounds, set broken bones, administer morphine to dying soldiers. She also knew what frostbite looked like in its early stages. By the 3rd day on the Atlantic, her fingertips had turned purple. By the 5th day, the purple had spread to her first knuckles. By the 10th day, lost in storms that delayed the crossing and sent waves crashing over the Liberty ship's bow, her fingers had gone black. For the last 13 days of the voyage, she'd stopped unwrapping the bandages to look. If she was going to lose her hands to American cruelty, she'd rather not watch it happen in slow motion. Sam reached for the scissors on his medical tray. Stainless steel gleaming under the fluorescent lights, sharp enough to cut through fabric bone lies. He looked at Greta's face. Her eyes were blue-gray hollow with exhaustion, fixed on nothing. She wasn't looking at him, wasn't looking at her hands, just staring at empty air like she'd already left her body and was watching from somewhere far away. This is it, she thought in German. This is when the torture begins. They'll cut off my fingers without anesthesia. Efficient American cruelty, just like the propaganda promised. Sam saw her flinch when the scissors touched the gauze, saw her entire body go rigid, saw her jaw clench and her breathing stop and her eyes squeeze shut, and he understood. She thought he was about to amputate right here, right now, without warning or mercy. No, Sam said quickly, holding up both hands, scissors pointing away from her. Not cutting off, just cutting bandages. Old bandages. See? He mimed, unwrapping with exaggerated slowness. His hands rotated around invisible gauze. Then he pointed to the roll of clean white bandages on the tray beside him. Sterile, so unused, waiting. Old off, he said, gesturing to her filthy wrappings. Nutio. He pointed to the clean ones. Help, medicine. Understand Greta's English was limited to what she'd learned in gymnasium before the war. 2 years of studying Shakespeare and American advertising slogans. Enough to understand breakfast cereal commercials, but not complex medical explanations. But tone carried meaning. And something in the way this American medic had sat down instead of standing over her, something in the way he'd pointed to clean bandages before touching her wounds, something in the gentle patience of his voice made her open her eyes again. She extended her hands, still trembling, still expecting pain, but trusting, for the first time in 5 weeks, trusting. Sam began cutting through the outer layers of gauze. The fabric had stiffened where blood and fluid had dried. It made a crisp sound as the scissors separated the fibers. Beneath the first layer, he found another, and beneath that, another. Someone in Belgium had wrapped her hands with German efficiency, multiple layers, tight enough to compress, not tight enough to cut off circulation completely. But nobody had changed the bandages since. Not during 3 weeks on the ship. Not during 6 days in a Virginia processing facility. Not during the train ride to Texas. 5 weeks of the same gauze against open wounds. 5 weeks of infection breeding in the warm, damp space between fabric and flesh. The deeper layers were wet, soaked through with seepage that had nowhere else to go. The smell intensified as each piece came away. Sam had to breathe through his mouth to keep from gagging. Not because he was weak-stomached. He'd cleaned wounds that smelled far worse, but because the smell told him just how bad the damage was. This kind of infection should have killed her. The fact that she was sitting here conscious, breathing normally, was medically improbable. Each piece of gauze that came free took bits of skin with it. Greta made small sounds, not screams, not cries, just tiny trapped noises like air escaping through cracks. Her shoulders started shaking. Fine tremors that ran down through her arms to her ruined hands. Not fear, pain. Pain so intense her body couldn't stay still even though her mind had learned to endure. Sam kept talking, low and steady. The words didn't matter. She couldn't understand most of them anyway. But the tone mattered. The rhythm mattered. The proof that he wasn't performing an execution but attempting a rescue. "Doing real good," he said. "You're braver than most soldiers I've treated. Just hang on a little longer. We're almost through the worst part." Greta focused on his voice the way a drowning person focuses on a rope. Something to hold on to while everything else was chaos and pain and terror. When the last layer of gauze came free, Sam filled a steel basin with warm water. Not hot, not cold, body temperature. He added antiseptic solution from a brown glass bottle, iodine that turned the water amber-colored like weak tea. He guided Greta's hands toward the basin slowly, giving her time to understand what was happening, giving her a chance to pull away if she wanted. She didn't pull away. Her hands entered the water and she gasped, a sharp, violent intake of breath like she'd been punched in the stomach. The antiseptic hit exposed nerve endings like liquid fire. Every raw surface screamed. Every damaged cell protested. Then the tears came. Not from pain exactly, though the pain was extraordinary, but from something else. Something that had been building for 5 weeks and finally found release. Silent tears. Steady, carving clean lines through the dust and grime on her face. She cried without sobbing, without making noise, just water falling from eyes that had held everything back for so long they'd forgotten how to let go. Sam let her hands soak for 3 full minutes, giving the antiseptic time to work, killing bacteria on the surface, preparing the tissue for what came next. While she soaked, he studied the damage with clinical detachment. 3rd-degree frostbite on the index, middle, and ring fingers of her left hand. The tissue was black, completely necrotic, dead all the way through from nail bed to first knuckle. 2nd-degree damage across both palms. The skin had split in multiple places. Frozen cracks that had never been properly cleaned, now filled with dried blood and infection. Red lines radiated up both wrists like poison rivers flowing toward her heart. Lymphangitis, the infection spreading through her lymphatic system. Another few days and it would reach her bloodstream. Sepsis would follow, then organ failure, then death. She should have been in a hospital bed with intravenous antibiotics and round-the-clock monitoring. Instead, she'd spent 5 weeks in cargo holds and processing facilities while her hands rotted. The paradox made Sam angry, not at her, never at her, but at whatever bureaucratic system had decided that enemy prisoners didn't deserve basic medical care. At whatever policy had left a 17-year-old nursing student to suffer with wounds that American medicine could easily treat. America had spent billions of dollars developing medical technology during this war. Sulfa drugs that fought infection and reduced mortality rates by 64%. Blood plasma that prevented shock. Penicillin still experimental, still limited in supply, but showing results that seemed like miracles. The U.S. Army Medical Corps had reduced the death rate from infected wounds to less than 4%, down from 30% in World War I. And this girl had been given none of it, because she wore the wrong uniform. Sam lifted her hands from the basin. Water dripped onto the floor. Her fingers were wrinkled from soaking. The healthy tissue looked pink and alive. The dead tissue looked gray and black and completely foreign. Now came the hard part. Debridement, the removal of necrotic tissue. Dead flesh had to be cut away completely, or it would continue to poison the living cells around it. But you couldn't cut too deep, couldn't damage the healthy tissue trying to regenerate beneath the death. It was delicate work, more art than science, learned through practice on hundreds of wounds in 2 years of treating combat casualties. Sam picked up surgical tweezers in his right hand, scissors in his left. Both instruments had been sterilized in boiling water an hour ago. Both gleamed silver under the medical ward's bright lights. He looked at Greta's face. Her eyes were open now, watching him, watching her hands, waiting to see if the American medic would be gentle or cruel. "This is going to hurt," Sam said quietly. "I'm real sorry about that. But we need to get all the dead tissue out, or the infection will just come back worse. I'll be as careful as I can, I promise." Greta didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the apology in his voice. She understood that he was warning her instead of simply inflicting pain. She nodded, once, sharp, German military training showing through exhaustion. Sam began. He used the tweezers to lift away pieces of necrotic skin. The dead tissue separated from living flesh with disturbing ease. It came away in strips, gray-black fragments that had once been functional cells but were now just dead weight poisoning her body. On her left index finger, the damage went deep, through the outer dermis into the subcutaneous layer. He could see exposed tissue underneath, raw and red and trying desperately to heal despite the infection. On her palms, the frozen cracks had created channels where bacteria had colonized and thrived. He cleaned each crack individually, lifting away dried blood, removing infected debris, exposing healthy tissue beneath. Greta shook harder with each piece he removed. Her breathing came in short gasps through clenched teeth. Sweat broke out on her forehead despite the cool temperature in the medical ward. Her hands wanted to pull away. Every instinct screamed at her to escape the pain, but she didn't move, didn't pull back, didn't try to stop him. Because somewhere in the last 15 minutes, she'd started to believe that maybe, possibly, incredibly, this American medic was actually trying to save her hands instead of destroy them. Sam kept talking while he worked, voice steady, rhythm constant, giving her something to focus on besides the pain. "You're doing great, really great. I can see healthy tissue under here. Good pink color. That means blood flow is still intact. Means these fingers want to live. We're just helping them along." He pointed with the tweezers to a spot on her palm where pink healthy skin was clearly visible beneath the gray dead layers. "See that? That right there, that's healing already. Your body's been fighting this infection for weeks without any help. Now we're going to give it the help it needs." Greta looked where he pointed, saw the pink, saw proof that underneath all the death and damage her hands were still trying to survive. Something shifted in her chest. Not hope exactly. Hope seemed too dangerous. But maybe the beginning of hope. The first crack in the wall of certainty that she was going to lose her hands, lose her future, lose any chance of being a nurse like she'd dreamed since she was 12 years old. The debridement took 43 minutes total. Sam worked with absolute focus, removing every piece of dead tissue he could find, cleaning every infected surface, making sure nothing remained that could trigger another crisis. By the time he finished, the steel basin held dark water mixed with blood and gray tissue fragments. The smell had changed from sweet rot to something cleaner, antiseptic and copper and the faint scent of iodine. Greta's hands looked worse than when he'd started, raw, exposed, bleeding in places where he'd cut away necrotic flesh. But they were clean, truly clean, for the first time in 5 weeks. Sam dried them carefully with sterile gauze, patting gently around the wounds. His touch was so light it barely registered, like he was handling something precious and fragile. Then he reached for the sulfa powder, small paper packets lined up on the tray, 6 of them, more than standard protocol recommended. But Sam wanted saturation coverage, wanted every exposed surface coated with the miracle drug that had reduced infection deaths by more than half. He tore open the first packet. White powder fell like snow onto raw flesh. It dusted her left palm, settled into the cracks, coated the exposed tissue on her fingers. Military medical studies had shown that sulfa drugs reduced infection rates by 64% when applied within 72 hours of injury. Applied 5 weeks late, the effectiveness dropped significantly. Maybe 30%, maybe less. But 30% was infinitely better than zero. 30% was the difference between keeping fingers and losing them to amputation. Sam opened the remaining packets, covered every wound, made sure no raw surface remained unprotected. Then he began wrapping fresh bandages. He started at the fingertips of her left hand, wrapped each digit individually from tip to base, then across the palm, around the wrist, over and back until her entire hand was encased in clean white gauze. The wrapping technique was specific, tight enough to provide compression and protect the wounds, loose enough that blood could still flow, too tight and he'd cause more damage, too loose and the bandages wouldn't do their job. He'd learned this skill treating hundreds of soldiers, farm boys from Iowa with shrapnel wounds, city kids from Brooklyn with burns, Marines from the Pacific with tropical infections. Each one had taught him something about the delicate balance between helping and hurting. When he finished Greta's left hand, he moved to her right. Less damage, but still serious. The same methodical process, the same careful attention. 20 minutes later, both hands were wrapped in gauze so white it seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. clean, protected, given their first real chance to heal in 5 weeks. Sam held him gently, checking his work, making sure the bandages would hold but not constrict. There he said, "That's better, isn't it?" Greta looked at her hands like she was seeing them for the first time. The white bandages were so clean they hurt to look at after 5 weeks of brown and yellow and black. They felt different too, lighter, like removing the infected gauze had removed physical weight. She looked up at Sam, then back at her hands, then back at him. Her lips moved, forming words in German that he couldn't understand but whose meaning was crystal clear in her tone. "Warm Hilfstemir, why are you helping me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with confusion and disbelief in the slow crumbling of everything she'd been taught about American cruelty. Sam didn't speak German, couldn't understand the literal words, but he understood the question in her eyes. The same question he'd seen in dozens of German POWs over the past year. The question that revealed just how effective Nazi propaganda had been. Why would Americans show mercy to enemies? Sam smiled. Not a big smile, just a small, gentle expression that reached his eyes and made him look younger than 22. "You're going to be okay," he said. 3 words she didn't fully understand, but the tone carried across the language barrier, carried across the gulf of nations at war, carried across 5 weeks of suffering and 3 years of propaganda. "You're going to be okay." And in that moment, something cracked in Greta Hoffman's understanding of the world. Just a hairline fracture, just the smallest opening, but enough to let in one impossible thought. Maybe they lied to us about everything. Real quick before we go deeper into this story, I need to tell you something important. If you've never heard World War II history like this, you need to hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to witness is not the version they taught in school. This is about the moments that happened quietly without cameras, without medals, without headlines. The moments that actually changed hearts and rebuilt a broken world. Drop a comment below if you know someone who served during this time. Share their story, because these memories matter. And what happens next will show you exactly why. Now let me take you back 3 weeks before that Texas examination room. Back to the frozen darkness that nearly killed Greta Hoffman before she ever reached American soil. February 14th, 1945. The port of Antwerp, Belgium. 40 German women stood in formation on a concrete dock while a cold rain fell from a sky the color of old steel. They wore the same gray wool auxiliary uniforms, carried the same small canvas bags containing everything they owned. Soap, spare undergarments, letters from family members they'd probably never see again. Greta Hoffman stood in the second row, 17 years old, blonde hair already cut short, hands pink and healthy and completely intact. She'd been captured 4 days earlier during Germany's final desperate offensive in the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge, Americans called it. The last gasp of a dying regime, historians would say later. But in December 1944, it felt like the world was ending in snow and artillery fire. Greta had been working at a field hospital 30 kilometers behind what was supposed to be the front line, treating frostbite cases mostly. German soldiers who'd been fighting in sub-zero temperatures without proper winter gear. Boys younger than her with blackened toes and fingers. She'd amputated more frostbitten digits in December than in her entire 2 years of training. Then the American counter-offensive had broken through. Fast, overwhelming, German lines collapsed like wet cardboard. The hospital staff had barely enough time to evacuate critical patients before American tanks rolled into the village. Greta had stayed behind with 3 other nurses. Someone needed to care for the soldiers too wounded to move. She'd expected to be captured eventually. Training had taught her that capture by Americans meant certain death. But when the U.S. Third Army medics arrived, they'd simply taken over the hospital and kept treating patients. German patients, enemy patients. They'd used American morphine and American bandages and American penicillin on boys wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. One American medic, a kid from Georgia with red hair and a southern accent so thick Greta couldn't understand a single word, had shown her how to apply the new sulfa powder, had demonstrated the proper technique for intravenous plasma administration, had treated her like a fellow medical professional instead of an enemy combatant. It had confused her terribly. Then the MPs had arrived, military police with stern faces and clipboards. They'd separated the German medical staff from the patients. loaded them into trucks, driven them to a processing facility in Antwerp, where hundreds of other German prisoners waited in barbed wire compounds. Greta had waited there for 2 weeks, sleeping on a concrete floor, eating soup that was mostly water and bread that was mostly sawdust, not tortured, not beaten, just cold and bored and waiting to find out what Americans did with enemy nurses. Now she stood on a dock watching a Liberty ship being loaded with cargo, the SS Resolute, a mass-produced American cargo vessel, built in 72 days by workers in a Baltimore shipyard, designed to carry tanks and ammunition and supplies across the Atlantic, not designed to carry human beings. But regulations had been adjusted. Geneva Convention said prisoners must be repatriated eventually. Ships were needed. Cargo space would suffice. A Belgian guard with a clipboard called names in badly accented German: Hartmann Lisa, Voss Margareta, Engels Waltraud. When he called Hoffman Greta, she stepped forward. The guard looked at her bandaged hands. She'd wrapped them herself 2 days ago after developing minor frostbite from sleeping near a drafty window. Nothing serious, just precautionary. "Those need medical attention," the guard asked in French, which Greta understood better than his German. "No," she replied. "Minor cold damage. Already treating." The guard made a note on his clipboard, gestured toward the ship. Inside, Greta found herself in a cargo hold 20 feet square. Metal walls, metal floor, metal ceiling, no windows, no bunks, no heat. 40 women packed into a space designed for ammunition crates. "They'll give us blankets," someone said. A woman named Margareta, older, maybe 35, former school teacher from Munich. Americans follow Geneva Convention. Minimum standards for prisoner transport. But no blankets came. The ship's engines started at 1800 hours. The cargo hold door slammed shut, locked from outside. Darkness dropped like a hammer. Someone had a lighter, flicked it on. The tiny flame revealed 40 faces pressed together in the metal box, eyes wide, breathing shallow. The lighter went out. Darkness again. The ship began to move. February in the North Atlantic is cruel. Storms roll across the water like stampeding horses. Waves reach heights of 30 feet. Temperatures drop below freezing. The Liberty ship's cargo hold had no insulation, no heating system. The metal walls conducted cold like they were designed for it. Within hours, frost formed on the interior surfaces. Within a day, the women's breath created frozen condensation that dripped onto them in an endless icy rain. They huddled together for warmth, pressed into a tight mass of shared body heat. 40 women rotating positions every hour because staying on the outside meant freezing. Greta gave up her position in the warm center on the second night. Margareta, the school teacher, had started coughing blood. Wet, rattling sounds that meant tuberculosis or pneumonia or both. Medical training told Greta that Margareta wouldn't survive a night on the outer edge where temperatures dropped into the 20s. So Greta traded places, took the outside position where frozen condensation dripped onto her shoulders, where the metal wall pressed against her back like a sheet of ice, where her fingers extended to maintain balance, touched the frozen surface, and began to freeze solid. She'd thought she was being noble, thought she was saving a life, thought that her youth and health would protect her from serious damage. She was wrong on all three counts. By the third day, Greta couldn't feel her fingertips. The cold had penetrated deep enough to damage nerve endings. No pain, just numbness spreading from her nails toward her palms. By the fifth day, her fingers had turned purple. Dark purple like a bruise that covered the entire digit. Frostbite progressing from first degree to second degree. Tissue damage beginning at the cellular level. By the 10th day, the purple had turned black. Margareta was still alive. Still coughing, but alive. Greta's sacrifice had worked. The cost was written in dead tissue on both hands. The ship hit major storms on day 12. Waves crashed over the bow. The entire vessel pitched and rolled like a toy in a bathtub. In the cargo hold, 40 women were thrown against metal walls. Several broke bones. One woman, a nurse from Hamburg named Sophie, hit her head so hard she didn't wake up. They laid her body in the corner and continued huddling for warmth. What else could they do? On day 14, the storms finally passed. The ship's motion steadied. Someone near the door heard voices outside. American voices, shouting about docking procedures and cargo manifests. They'd reached land. When the cargo hold door finally opened, daylight flooded in like a physical force. 40 women blinked against the brightness, stumbled toward the opening on legs that had forgotten how to walk. A U.S. Navy medic stood at the threshold. Young kid, maybe 20. He looked into the hold and his face went white. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Then louder, turning to shout over his shoulder, "Get a medical team down here now. We got casualties." He started helping women out of the hold. When he reached for Greta's hand to assist her, he recoiled. "Ma'am," he said, voice shaking. "Ma'am, you need immediate medical attention." But Greta barely heard him. She was staring at the sky. Blue sky, real sky, Virginia sky, American sky, the first natural light she'd seen in 14 days. Sophie's body was logged as a transport casualty, buried in a military cemetery outside Norfolk with a marker that read "Unknown German National." No family notified, no ceremony, just a hole in the ground and a wooden cross. Greta stood at the graveside for exactly 2 minutes. That's all the MPs allowed. Then they loaded her and the other 38 survivors into trucks and drove them to a processing facility. 6 days in Virginia, concrete barracks, medical screening, intelligence interviews asking the same questions over and over. What unit were you with? What did you see? What do you know about weapons, troop movements, strategic plans? Greta answered honestly. "I'm a nursing student. I treated frostbite. I don't know anything about military strategy." Nobody looked at her hands. Nobody changed her bandages. Nobody seemed to care that infection was spreading up her wrists in angry red lines. Geneva Convention said prisoners deserve basic medical care. But basic was a flexible term. Basic meant alive on arrival at the next facility. Basic meant not actively dying this exact minute. On March 8th, they loaded her onto another transport, this time a train, heading west. 40 women in a passenger car with actual seats and windows and a bathroom that flushed. Luxury compared to the ship. They rolled through Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, American countryside passing outside the windows. Farms, towns, cities untouched by bombs. Children playing in yards. Cars driving on paved roads. Electric lights burning bright even in daylight. Greta pressed her face to the window and tried to reconcile what she was seeing with what Goebbels' broadcasts had claimed about America. Radio reports had insisted Americans were starving, that their economy had collapsed, that their people lived in desperate poverty while their government spent everything on war machines. But the towns passing by looked prosperous, well-fed, intact. Either every broadcast had been fabricated or this was an elaborate show put on for prisoners. Greta didn't know which option was more disturbing. The train arrived at Fort Sam Houston on March 9, 1945. Morning light painted the Texas sky orange and gold. The air tasted different, drier, hotter even in early March. Sergeant Roy Kemp stood on the platform with a clipboard. 38 years old, gray hair cut military short, face weathered from 2 decades in the Army. He'd lost a nephew at Normandy Beach. 20-year-old kid named Michael who'd stepped on a mine during the third wave and died screaming for his mother. Kemp had every reason to hate the women climbing off that train. But when the doors opened and he saw their condition, something shifted in his chest. These weren't soldiers. These were girls. Exhausted, filthy, barely able to stand. "Ladies," he said in slow, clear English. "Welcome to Texas. I know you've had a rough journey. Let's get you cleaned up and fed. Ladies, not prisoners, not enemies, ladies." Greta stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for the mask to drop and the cruelty to begin. It didn't. Kemp escorted them toward a low white building with a red cross painted on the roof. Protection against air raids that would never reach Texas. Inside the building smelled like disinfectant and floor wax and something clean that Greta hadn't breathed in months. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Bright and steady, no flickering, no shadows. Everything gleamed white and sterile and impossibly clean. Where was the torture chamber? Where were the cruel guards with dogs and whips? Where was the America that Goebbels had promised Captain Aldrich? Peyton ran the medical intake with tired efficiency. 53 years old. Boston physician who'd volunteered in 1942, thinking he'd serve overseas and got assigned to POW administration in Texas instead. He'd examined hundreds of German prisoners, U-boat crews, Luftwaffe pilots, Africa Corps soldiers, most arrived thin but functional. These women were different. Malnutrition he noted for the first girl, vitamin deficiency, send to kitchen for supplemental rations. Exposure injuries he wrote for the second, minor frostbite, standard treatment protocol. Then Greta Hoffman sat down in the examination chair. Peyton gestured toward her hands. Let me see. She extended them, trembling. The bandages were brown and yellow and black. The smell made Peyton's eyes water. He began unwrapping. The gauze stuck to dead skin underneath. Greta made a small trapped sound. The bandages came away in pieces. Peyton stopped moving, stared at what was underneath for 3 full seconds. Then he turned toward the door and called out, Pruitt, I need you here, now. Sam Pruitt had been restocking supply cabinets in the next room. 22 years old, dark hair that never stayed combed, hands that moved with careful precision. Oklahoma accent thick enough to cut with a knife. He'd wanted to fight, wanted to be a combat medic on the front lines. But the ringing in his left ear damage from scarlet fever at age 7 had disqualified him from deployment. He'd spent 6 months feeling like a coward, feeling useless while other men shipped out to die in Europe. Then the wounded started arriving. Boys his age with holes in their bodies, men missing limbs, soldiers with eyes that had seen things no human should see. Sam had stopped feeling useless and started feeling necessary, but he'd never treated anything like this. He walked into the examination room and saw Greta's hands, saw tissue so black it looked like charcoal, saw infections spreading up her wrists in red lines, saw damage that should have killed her weeks ago. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Peyton was already making notes. 3rd-degree frostbite, severe infection, possible sepsis developing. Treatment required immediately. How long has she been like this? Sam asked. Peyton checked the manifest. Ship departed Belgium February 14th, arrived Virginia March 9th. Processing 6 days. That's 5 weeks minimum since initial injury. 5 weeks of dead tissue poisoning her bloodstream. 5 weeks of infection spreading unchecked. 5 weeks without antibiotics or proper wound care. The paradox made Sam furious. America had spent billions developing medical technology, sulfa drugs, plasma, penicillin. The U.S. Army Medical Corps had reduced infection death rates to less than 4%, and this 17-year-old girl had been given none of it. We need to debride immediately, Peyton said. Remove all necrotic tissue before infection reaches bone. If it's already in the bone, he didn't finish. They both knew. Amputation. Maybe the whole hand, maybe her life if they were too late, Sir Sam said carefully. We should consider penicillin. The sulfa might not be enough if the infection has already spread to her lymphatic system. Peyton's eyebrows rose. Penicillin. You know our stock levels. We have 48 vials left for 400 German POWs and 2,000 American servicemen on this base. Penicillin is reserved for critical cases only. American critical cases. With respect, sir, this is critical. If the infection reaches her bloodstream in the next 72 hours, she'll develop sepsis. Without penicillin, mortality rate is over 90%. Then we amputate. That's the protocol, Corporal. Sam's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. You didn't argue with a captain. Not directly, not if you wanted to keep your stripes. Peyton's tone softened slightly. Look, I understand, but we have limited resources and unlimited need. I have to make calls based on priority. You debride. You clean. You use sulfa powder heavy application. You monitor for fever. If she develops sepsis, you call me immediately and we reassess. But I will not authorize penicillin for a German prisoner when I might need it for an American soldier tomorrow. Do you understand, yes, sir? Pruitt, this is your case. Don't leave anything that'll necrotize further. Keep her here for observation. Any signs of sepsis, red streaking past the elbow. This is fever above 102, you call me. Understood. Understood, sir. Peyton left. The room felt suddenly larger, quieter. Sam gathered his supplies, surgical scissors, tweezers, antiseptic solution, clean gauze, sulfa powder in small paper packets. He approached Greta slowly. She watched him with eyes that expected cruelty and had already decided not to resist. Like she'd learned that fighting only made things worse. Like she'd learned to endure. Sam had seen that expression before, on soldiers who'd been wounded too many times. who'd used up all their hope and had nothing left but stubborn survival. It made him think about his brother Tommy, 20 years old, serving with the Marines somewhere in the Pacific. Tommy's last letter arrived 2 weeks ago, had said something that haunted Sam every night. I killed a Japanese soldier yesterday. 17 years old, same age as Susie back home. He was trying to surrender, but I didn't see his hands up in time. I shot him anyway. I can't stop thinking about his face, Sam. I can't stop wondering if he had a family, if someone's waiting for him to come home. I can't stop seeing his eyes. Sam carried that letter in his footlocker, read it every night before sleeping. And now he was looking at a 17-year-old enemy, except she wasn't a soldier, she was a nurse, and she was trying to surrender to pain. And he could see her hands. This time he could save them. He'd promised himself, next time I see hands, I save them. Sam pulled up a stool and sat down, toes so their eyes were level. All right, he said quietly. This is going to hurt. I'm real sorry about that. But we're going to fix this. You're going to keep these fingers. I promise you that. And that's when the 43 minutes began. The 43 minutes that would change everything Greta Hoffman believed about enemies and mercy and which side of the war had been telling the truth. Before we continue, I need to pause here and tell you something important. What you're watching isn't just medical care. This is a direct assault on Nazi propaganda. Because every time Sam chose gentleness over cruelty, every time he explained instead of commanded, every time he asked permission, instead of demanding compliance, he was proving that everything Goebbels had said about Americans was a lie. If you're finding value in this story, hit that like button and drop a comment. Tell me, what traditional American values do you think are most important to preserve today? Because this story, what happens next with bacon and eggs and cold Coca-Cola, is going to show you why those values matter. Let's get back to Texas, March 1945, where breakfast was about to become a weapon against hatred. Greta Hoffman returned to the medical ward every morning at 0800 hours for the next 12 days. The routine became familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. An MP would escort her from the women's detention compound, barbed wire fences that seemed decorative compared to what she'd seen in Europe, guard towers where men read newspapers and drank coffee, like this was just another boring assignment instead of prisoner supervision. She'd walk across the parade ground in early morning light. Texas sun, already hot even in March. The air tasted like dust and something green she'd later learn was mesquite. The sky stretched wider than any sky she'd ever seen in Germany. Endless blue that made her feel small and exposed and strangely free. Sam would be waiting in the same examination room. Supplies already laid out on the metal tray. Basin, antiseptic, fresh gauze, sulfa powder, surgical scissors that caught the light and made her flinch every time, even though she knew now what they were for. She'd sit in the same chair by the window, hold out her hands without being asked. He'd unwrap the old bandages carefully, checking for signs that the infection was spreading or retreating, examining each finger for changes in color, temperature, swelling. His touch was always gentle, always asked permission through gesture, even when words failed them. Day 1, red streaking still visible up both wrists, swelling severe, tissue hot to touch, high infection risk. Day 2, streaking slightly faded, swelling unchanged. Greta's fever at 99.8, low grade but concerning. Day 3, streaking reduced by 40%. Swelling decreased noticeably, fever down to 98.9, pink tissue visible under necrotic layers. Day 4, infection clearing, new skin cells regenerating, the black tissue on her fingertips starting to separate from healthy flesh underneath. Sam reported to Captain Peyton that morning. She's healing ahead of schedule, sir. The sulfa powder is working better than expected. I think she's going to keep all 10 fingers. Peyton looked up from his paperwork, surprised. You're sure? Yes, sir. The necrotic tissue is sloughing off naturally. Healthy tissue underneath is pink and warm. No signs of bone involvement. And if we can prevent secondary infection during the healing phase, she'll have full function. Peyton was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Good work, Corporal. Continue current treatment protocol. Daily debridement until all dead tissue is clear. Then we can move to every other day. Yes, sir. Peyton returned to his paperwork. But he was smiling slightly. The kind of smile that suggested he was pleased to be proven wrong about something. On day 5, after the morning treatment, Sam said something in English that Greta didn't fully understand. He gestured toward a building adjacent to the medical ward, made washing motions with his hands, pointed to her stained uniform. Shower, he said slowly. Hot water. Clean uniform after. Greta followed a female MP to the shower facility. Individual stalls, real soap that smelled like lavender, clean towels folded on a bench, and hot water, not lukewarm, not rationed. Hot. Greta stood under the stream and felt 3 years of lies dissolve down the drain. In Germany, hot water had been a luxury since 1942. You bathed in cold water heated in pots on the stove if you had fuel for the stove. You rationed every bucket because coal was scarce and getting scarcer. Every authority figure had insisted this sacrifice was necessary, that everyone suffered equally under wartime austerity. That deprivation built character and strength. But here in an American prisoner of war facility, hot water flowed endlessly from a pipe in the wall. Casual, abundant, unremarkable. Every broadcast had claimed Americans were starving, that their economy had collapsed under the weight of war, that they lived in desperate poverty while their government funneled everything into weapons. But this water was hot. This soap was real. This facility had electricity that worked all day and all night without rationing. Either every word from Berlin had been fabricated, or this was an elaborate deception designed to break prisoner morale. Greta didn't know which option was more terrifying. She washed her hair for the first time in 6 weeks, felt the hot water open her pores, felt steam soften skin that had been tight with grime and fear, felt something she hadn't felt since before the war. Dignity, the simple human dignity of being clean. She cried under that shower, not from pain, not from fear, from the overwhelming realization that maybe possibly incredibly, Americans actually believed that even enemy prisoners deserved hot water and soap. What kind of enemy treated prisoners like this? When she returned to the medical ward in a clean uniform, dark blue cotton that actually fit, Sam noticed immediately. Feeling better, he asked. She nodded. Then in careful English, thank you for everything. Her accent was thick, her grammar uncertain, but the words were clear enough. Sam smiled. You're healing up real nice. Another week and you might not need daily treatments. Another week. Greta realized she'd been so focused on surviving the present that she hadn't thought about the future. What happened after her hands healed? Would they send her back to Germany? To Hamburg, which British reports said was now 80% rubble? To a family she hadn't heard from in 8 months? Or would she stay here in this impossible place where enemies got hot showers and medical care? She didn't know, and for the first time in 5 weeks, she wasn't sure which outcome she wanted. On day 7, after Sam finished wrapping her hands, she pointed to them, then to him, then pressed her palm to her chest. Danke, she said. Thank you. He understood that one. You're welcome. She frowned, frustrated by the language barrier, pulled out a small German-English dictionary that one of the other women had found in the base library. She flipped through pages, found words, pointed, you, good, kind. She flipped more pages. I, not, understand, more flipping. Why, Sam blinked. You speak English. She held her thumb and forefinger close together. Little, school, before war. Not good, but some. Well, he grinned. Your English is better than my German, which is exactly 0 words. She almost smiled. The expression was tentative, fragile, like something she'd forgotten how to do properly. Then she said the thing that had been haunting her since that first treatment, the thing that kept her awake at night in the barracks. In Germany, they tell us Americans are cruel, like animals. They say, if captured, you will hurt us. Torture, kill, maybe worse. She paused, choosing words carefully from her limited vocabulary. I think when I come here, I think you will let my hands die. Punishment for being German. But you help. You use medicine. You are careful. I do not understand why. Sam stopped organizing his medical supplies. Because you're a human being who was hurt, he said simply. That's all that matters. Not what flag you served under, not what language you speak. You needed help. I had the ability to help. The rest is just politics. She was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then in careful English, "I think this is good answer. I think maybe this is reason America will win. Not just because you have more guns, more planes, more everything, because you still see people as people." The paradox was sharp and painful. Two nations had spent years training their populations to hate each other, to dehumanize the enemy, to believe the other side was fundamentally evil. Millions of dollars poured into propaganda designed to make killing easier, surrender unthinkable mercy impossible. And here in a Texas hospital ward, 43 minutes of careful medical treatment and 1 week of daily bandage changes had shattered all of it. Sam finished putting away his supplies. "They're good for another day. Keep them dry. Don't use your fingers for any heavy work yet. Healing tissue is fragile." She nodded. Then in German accented English that was getting clearer each day. "Tomorrow I come back. Same time." Same time, he confirmed. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Sam." He looked up. It was the first time she'd used his name. "Thank you for seeing me as person, not enemy." Sam smiled. "You made that easy. You never acted like an enemy. Just a brave kid trying to survive something terrible." March 16, 1945. Day 3 of treatment. The day everything changed. Sergeant Kemp appeared at the women's barracks at 06:45 hours with an announcement. "You're cleared for mess hall privileges. Same food as everyone else on base. Breakfast starts at 0700. The 40 German women exchanged glances. Waltraud Engels, the oldest at 32, a communications officer who'd warned everyone not to trust American kindness, said what they were all thinking. "It's propaganda food. They'll feed us well, take photographs for newspapers, then reduce rations once the cameras leave. Standard psychological warfare." Greta said nothing, just wrapped her bandaged hands in the shawl Consuelo Rivera had given her. Consuelo was the laundry supervisor, 56 years old with iron gray hair and hands roughened by decades of work. She'd lost a nephew at Normandy and a son-in-law in the Ardennes. She had every reason to hate German women. Instead, she'd given Greta a shawl when she noticed her shivering during the evening count. "Para el frío, mija," Consuelo had said. For the cold. Greta walked toward the mess hall, ready to confirm what Waltraud believed, ready for the deception to reveal itself. The mess hall smelled like something Greta didn't have words for at first. Her German vocabulary failed. Her limited English couldn't capture it. It smelled like smoke and salt and fat and something cooking that made her stomach clench with sudden desperate hunger. The line moved forward. American soldiers, real combat soldiers back from Europe, for medical recovery, stood in line with them. Not separate, not segregated. Same line, same food, same plates and trays and silverware. A mess sergeant with a Brooklyn accent so thick it sounded like a foreign language handed her a tray. "Morning, miss. Eggs scrambled or sunny side?" Greta stared at him. This was a choice. You could choose how your eggs were cooked. "Scrambled," she said carefully. "Please, you got it, sweetheart." He scooped yellow eggs onto her plate. Fluffy eggs. Real eggs. Not the powdered substitute she'd eaten in Germany since 1943. Then he added 3 strips of something dark and crispy that crackled when the serving spoon touched them. Then toast, butter, jam that was actually made from fruit instead of sugar beets. Then a glass of milk, real milk, cold, white. And finally, from a metal cooler behind him, a glass bottle with red and white labeling she'd seen in propaganda posters plastered all over Hamburg. Coca-Cola, the American poison drink, Goebbels had called it. Capitalist sugar water that rots teeth and minds and turns citizens into mindless consumers. The mess sergeant popped the cap with a bottle opener, handed it to her with a smile. "Welcome to Texas, miss. Enjoy your breakfast." Greta carried her tray to a table like she was carrying evidence of a crime, sat down slowly, stared at the food arranged on white ceramic. Waltraud sat across from her tray, identical. "Don't eat it," Waltraud whispered in German. They were watching. It's a test, probably drugged or poisoned, but Greta's hands, still wrapped in white gauze, reached for the bacon. The crispy dark strips Sam had mentioned yesterday when he'd said you'll need protein to help those hands heal. "Make sure you eat the bacon at breakfast." She picked up one strip, bit into it, and her entire understanding of the war shattered like glass hitting concrete. It wasn't the taste exactly, though the taste was extraordinary. salt and smoke and fat and something savory sweet that made her close her eyes involuntarily. It wasn't just that it was delicious, though. It was the most delicious thing she'd eaten in 3 years of rationing and scarcity and ersatz everything. It was what the bacon represented. Abundance. Casual, thoughtless, unremarkable abundance. This wasn't special food for propaganda photographs. This was what Americans ate for breakfast. Every day. Without thinking about it. The mess sergeant had given her 3 strips like it was nothing. Like there was more where that came from. Unlimited more. Bacon that appeared every morning like the sun. In Germany, meat had been rationed since 1939. You got your allocation once a week if you were lucky. A few ounces, carefully measured, distributed according to work status and party loyalty. You made it last. You stretched it with bread and potatoes. You never ever had enough. But this bacon was abundant, wastefully abundant. 3 whole strips for one breakfast for one prisoner. Greta took another bite, then reached for the Coca-Cola. The bottle was cold, refrigerated, another casual luxury. She'd heard about American refrigeration. Posters had claimed it was capitalist excess, unnecessary technology that wasted resources. She tilted the bottle, took a sip, bubbles, sweetness, a flavor she couldn't name, something like caramel and vanilla and spices all mixed together. Not medicine, not poison, not capitalist corruption, just a drink, a good drink. She looked up and saw American soldiers eating the same food, laughing, talking, relaxed. Nobody was watching the German women to see if they ate the propaganda meal. Nobody seemed to care. Nobody was taking photographs. This was just breakfast. Normal, daily, unremarkable. And in that moment, sitting in a Texas mess hall with bacon grease on her fingers and Coca-Cola fizzing in her mouth, Greta Hoffman understood something that would change her life forever. Everything she'd been taught was a lie. Not metaphorically, not partially, not exaggerated for effect. Completely, systematically, comprehensively a lie. Every broadcast from Berlin had lied about Americans torturing prisoners, had lied about food scarcity being everyone's shared burden, had lied about American cruelty and moral bankruptcy and cultural degeneracy. If they'd lied about bacon, what else had they lied about? She set down the Coca-Cola bottle, looked at her bandaged hands, thought about Sam Pruitt spending 43 minutes saving fingers that belonged to an enemy, thought about Captain Peyton authorizing medicine for someone who'd worn a swastika armband, thought about Sergeant Kemp saying ladies instead of prisoners. And she realized she'd been so focused on surviving American cruelty that she'd missed the systematic mercy happening all around her. But there was one question she still couldn't answer. One thing that didn't make sense no matter how she examined it. Why? Why were they doing this? What did Americans gain from treating enemies like human beings? How did kindness advance their war effort? That question would haunt her until day 6, until the night everything went wrong and she learned the answer in the worst possible way. March 19th, 1945, 02:47 hours. Sam woke to pounding on his barracks door. Corporal Pruitt, medical emergency. The German girl, she's burning up. He dressed in 40 seconds flat, didn't bother tying his boots, just shoved his feet into unlaced combat boots and ran across the parade ground in darkness. The duty nurse met him at the ward entrance, face pale, hands shaking. Fever spiked to 104.2 at 0200 hours. She's delirious. Shaking. I think it's sepsis. Sam's stomach dropped to his feet. Sepsis, blood poisoning. The infection had reached her bloodstream. Once sepsis started, you had maybe 72 hours before organ failure. Kidneys first, then liver, then heart. Death came in stages, each one more painful than the last. Without penicillin, mortality rate was over 90%. He found Greta in her bed convulsing under thin blankets, skin flushed red with fever, eyes unfocused, muttering in German words tumbling over each other in desperate confusion. Vater die Bomben, meine Hände, es tut so weh. Father, the bombs, my hands, it hurts so much. Sam unwrapped her bandages with shaking fingers. The gauze was soaked through with fluid. The infection had returned with a vengeance. Red streaks raced up both arms past her elbows. The tissue that had been pinking up yesterday was now inflamed, swollen, angry. The healthy skin he'd been so proud of saving was losing the war against bacteria that had finally breached her body's defenses. The sulfa powder had failed. Her immune system, weakened by 5 weeks of cold and starvation and stress, couldn't fight anymore. Without penicillin, she would die. Sam stood in that darkened ward and heard his brother Tommy's voice from that letter. I killed a 17-year-old yesterday. I can't stop thinking about his face. Next time I save them. He'd promised himself. Next time I see someone 17 years old dying, I save them. Sam walked to the locked medicine cabinet, used his emergency access key. The lock clicked open. Inside, neat rows of vials, morphine, sulfa, plasma, and penicillin. 48 vials remaining, reserved for American servicemen only. Captain's orders, explicit orders. Sam removed 2 vials, enough for a 3-day course, enough to save her life, enough to get him court-martialed for misappropriation of critical medical supplies during wartime. He prepared the injection, hands steady despite everything, despite knowing this could end his career, despite knowing Captain Peyton had been crystal clear about penicillin protocols. But Sam had also taken an oath, not to America though he loved his country, not to the Army though he respected the chain of command, to healing, to doing no harm, to treating the patient in front of him regardless of uniform nationality, politics, propaganda, or war. I'm sorry, Greta, he whispered, knowing she couldn't hear him through the fever delirium. I promised you'd keep your fingers. I'm keeping that promise. He administered the first dose at 3:12 hours. Intramuscular injection. The penicillin would take hours to reach therapeutic levels in her bloodstream, hours during which the infection would continue spreading, hours during which she could still die. Sam pulled a chair beside her bed, sat down, and waited. For dawn, for the fever to break, for Captain Peyton to discover what he'd done. Whichever came first. What Sam didn't know was that Captain Peyton was already awake, standing outside the ward door, listening. Peyton had followed Sam across the parade ground after the duty nurse called him to, had watched through the window as Sam unlocked the medicine cabinet, watched him remove the penicillin, watched him make the choice that could end his military career. And Peyton had to decide something. Report this violation, follow regulations, maintain the protocol that said American lives took priority over enemy lives, or become complicit in systematic mercy. Peyton stood in the darkness outside the medical ward and thought about his son. Lieutenant James Peyton, serving with Patton's Third Army somewhere in Germany right now. Last letter had arrived 2 weeks ago. Short, censored, but containing one line that had haunted Peyton every day since. Dad, I watched a German medic treat American wounded after we captured an aid station. He could have run. Instead, he stayed and saved 3 of our guys. Made me wonder what we're really fighting for. What were they fighting for? To prove Americans were crueler than Nazis, to demonstrate that democracy meant nothing when it was inconvenient, to show that mercy was just propaganda that evaporated when resources got tight, or to prove that American values actually meant something even when they cost something. Peyton watched through the window as Sam sat beside Greta's bed, watched him check her pulse, watched him adjust her blankets with the same care he'd shown for the past 6 days. And Peyton made his choice. He walked into the ward. Sam stood immediately. Sir, I can explain. Sit down, Corporal. Sam sat. Peyton picked up Greta's medical chart, scanned the overnight notes, looked at the empty penicillin vial on the bedside table. His face was unreadable. Walk with me. They left the ward, crossed the parade ground in pre-dawn darkness. Neither spoke for a full minute. Finally, Peyton stopped near the flagpole. You used penicillin without authorization. Yes, sir. You removed it from a locked cabinet using your emergency access key. Yes, sir. You administered 2 vials to a German prisoner of war when I explicitly told you that penicillin was reserved for American servicemen only. Yes, sir. Silence. Just the sound of wind moving across the Texas plains. Then Peyton sighed. A sound of exhaustion and something else. Maybe respect. The medical board is going to want an explanation. I understand, sir. They might recommend disciplinary action, possibly court-martial for misappropriation of critical supplies during wartime. I understand that too, sir. Peyton turned to face him directly. What am I supposed to tell them, Borper? That you saved a girl's life, that you violated direct orders to prevent an unnecessary death, that you chose your oath to healing over your oath to follow the chain of command. Sam met his eyes. Tell them the truth, sir. Tell them I saw a 17-year-old patient dying of sepsis, and I had the medicine to save her, and I used it. Tell them if they want to court-martial me for that, I'll accept the consequences. But I won't apologize for keeping my promise. Peyton was quiet for a long moment. Then unexpectedly, he smiled. You know what I'm going to tell them, Pruitt? I'm going to tell them that I authorized that penicillin. I'm going to tell them that upon reviewing the case at 0200 hours, I determined the infection had progressed to critical status and required immediate intervention to prevent loss of life. I'm going to tell them that you followed my direct orders and saved a patient's life using appropriate medical judgment. Sam blinked. Sir, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I'm going to. You know why? He gestured back toward the medical ward where Greta lay fighting for her life. Because 40 minutes ago, I watched a German girl wake up for just a moment, see her hands still attached to her arms and start crying. Not from pain, from relief, from hope. And I realized something I should have known from the beginning. We're not here to decide who deserves to live and who deserves to die based on what uniform they wore or which side they fought on. We're here to heal, period. You reminded me of that, Corporal. You reminded me why I became a doctor 30 years ago. You reminded me what we're actually fighting for. So if the medical board wants to come after someone for wasting penicillin on the enemy, they can come after me. Sam stood speechless as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the Texas sky orange and gold an impossible blue. Sir Sam said finally, why you didn't have to cover for me? You could have followed regulations. Peyton looked toward the sunrise. I have a son fighting in Germany right now, and every day I wonder if some German medic is going to find him wounded and decide whether he deserves help. I'm choosing to believe that mercy exists on both sides, that somewhere over there someone is making the same choice you just made. Because if we stop seeing each other as human beings, then what the hell are we fighting for? The sun cleared the horizon completely. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle called reveille, and Sam understood. Mercy wasn't weakness. Mercy wasn't naive. Mercy wasn't foolish optimism in the face of brutal reality. Mercy was the hardest, bravest, most important choice you could make, especially when it cost you something. Greta's fever broke at 05:23 hours, dropped from 104.2 to 99.1 in under 3 hours. The penicillin was working. By 0800 hours, she was conscious, weak, confused, but alive. Sam checked her hands. The red streaking had stopped advancing. The swelling was already decreasing. The infection that had been racing toward her heart had been stopped cold by American medicine, administered by an Oklahoma farm boy who'd promised to save her fingers. Over the next week, Greta healed faster than anyone expected. The necrotic tissue sloughed away completely, revealing pink, healthy skin underneath. The infection cleared. New tissue regenerated with remarkable speed. By day 12, Sam declared her ready for discharge from daily medical treatment. You'll still need to keep them clean and dry, he said, while wrapping her hands for the last time. No heavy work for another month. But you're going to have full function, all 10 fingers. Greta looked at her hands, still scarred, still marked by faint pink lines where the frostbite had gone deepest, but alive, functional, saved. How do I thank you, she asked in careful English. You just did. No, she said. How do I thank you for showing me that everything I was taught was wrong, for proving that Americans are not monsters, for treating me like person when you had every reason to let me die? Sam was quiet for a moment. You don't thank me, he said finally. You remember. You remember that people on both sides of this war made choices. Some chose cruelty, some chose mercy. When you go home, whenever that is, you remember that mercy exists, and you choose it when you can. On May 8, 1945, a Tuesday morning that felt like any other until it wasn't, Germany surrendered. Unconditional. Total. Hitler dead. Berlin fallen. The war in Europe was over. Greta was working in the base laundry when the announcement came over the radio. Outside, the base erupted. Servicemen shouting, trucks honking. Celebration. Inside the laundry, the German women continued folding sheets in silence. Consuela found Greta during lunch break. Brought her a Coca-Cola from the commissary. War's over, mija. Time to think about going home. Greta took the Coca-Cola, thought about Hamburg, about streets that were probably rubble, about a mother she hadn't heard from in 9 months, about a sister who might be dead or alive or anywhere in between. What if there's nothing to go home to? Consuela smiled sadly. Then you build something new. That's what people do. We survive. We rebuild. You're young, you've got time. 2 weeks later, Sam received reassignment orders. California, preparing for the Pacific invasion. Japan was still fighting. A second letter arrived the same day. Tommy's handwriting, Pacific postmark. Sam opened it with shaking hands. Sam, I'm okay. We took the island. Lost a lot of good men, but I made it through. I've been thinking about that Japanese kid I shot, the one who was trying to surrender. I don't know if this makes sense, but I hope somewhere someone showed him kindness before the end. The way you probably show kindness to the wounded who come through your ward. Maybe that's how we win this thing. Not by being crueler than them, by being better. Stay safe, brother. Tommy folded the letter carefully. Put it in his footlocker next to the first one. Tommy was alive. And somehow across 8,000 miles of ocean, they'd both learned the same lesson. Mercy mattered. He found Greta near the commissary on his last day. She was carrying a box of supplies, hands bare now. No bandages, just scars. You're leaving, she said. Not a question. Yeah. New orders. She set down the box, extended her right hand, the one that had been damaged worst. Thank you, Sam, for my hands, for showing me that not all Americans are what they told us. He shook her hand carefully. Her grip was strong. Good luck, Greta. I hope you find your family. I hope you rebuild something beautiful. Good luck to you. I hope you save many more people. They stood there for a moment. Two people whose lives had intersected briefly in the chaos of war, who taught each other something about humanity that no propaganda could erase. Then he left, and Greta returned to her work, and the Texas sun blazed overhead, indifferent and eternal. Greta Hoffmann was repatriated to Germany in November 1945, found her mother alive in a village outside Hamburg, found her sister married to a British soldier in Manchester, found a country destroyed but beginning the long, slow work of rebuilding. She returned to nursing school in 1946, worked as a nurse for 42 years, married a teacher named Friedrich, had 3 children, told them every year about the American medic who'd saved her hands when he had every reason not to. She lived to see the Berlin Wall fall, lived to see Germany reunified, lived to see her grandchildren grow up in a peaceful Europe. And sometimes on summer days when the heat shimmered just right, she'd look at her hands. Old now, spotted with age, marked by faint scars that never quite faded. And she'd remember Texas, the dust, the impossible sky, the young medic who'd proven that mercy was stronger than hate. Sam Pruitt worked at veterans' hospitals for 33 years, married a nurse named Dorothy, had 2 sons who became doctors, thought about Greta sometimes, wondered if she'd made it home. In 1978, planning for retirement, he tried to find her, wrote to the Red Cross, searched military archives. But the trail was cold, too much time, too many lost records. He died in 96, never knowing that the girl whose hands he'd saved had lived a full life and whispered his name with her final breath. November 12, 2009, Berlin. Greta Hoffmann died at 81, surrounded by family. Her last words in English that still carried a German accent after 64 years were simple. Thank you, Sam. I was okay. Her children didn't understand, didn't know who Sam was, but her daughter wrote it down anyway, sensing it was important. 6 years later, DNA testing connected the families. Sam's grandson, Daniel, a surgeon, met Greta's granddaughter, Anna, a trauma nurse in Berlin. They stood together, holding a photograph. 40 German women outside Fort Sam Houston Medical Ward. March 1945. Greta visible in the back row, hands wrapped in white bandages. She made it, Daniel said. Your grandmother survived. My grandfather would have wanted to know that. And your grandfather, Anna replied through tears. He saved her hands. She never forgot him, never stopped being grateful. 2 families, 2 nations, one shared history of grace-defeating propaganda. The hands that wouldn't die became hands that healed for 42 years. The medic who risked everything became a legend in a German family who never forgot kindness. And 43 minutes of careful medical treatment became proof that individual human beings could choose to be better than their circumstances demanded. March 1945, Texas. A girl's hands wrapped in gauze so white it hurt to look at. A medic working carefully, gently treating an enemy like a patient. And somewhere in that exchange, something shifted. Mercy defeated hate. Kindness destroyed lies. And two people carried that truth forward into a world that desperately needed to remember it. If this story moved you, do three things. Subscribe to this channel for more untold history. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment about what traditional American values we need to preserve today. Because mercy isn't a relic of the past. It's a choice we make every day. And sometimes, rarely, impossibly, it changes everything. Thank you for watching. And remember, mercy always wins. Not immediately, not obviously, but eventually, inevitably, completely. Mercy always wins.